It's great to be here. Thanks, Malik. That was a very, very kind introduction. When I was about your age, a little younger, I thought maybe I wanted to be an architect. I also loved geometry. I thought geometry was the most interesting kind. I liked math. I was good at math, but geometry in particularly interested me. I went off to school, went to a liberal arts school, did not really find that to my liking, left school, worked in the animation industry for a few years, and then went back to school and got a degree in computer science. I'm sorry, wait, I forgot. I went to architecture school, decided that wasn't for me, went to art school, decided that wasn't for me, went out, worked in the industry, went back to school, got a practical degree in computer science and computer graphics, and then ended up at Bell Labs for a number of years. And many years down the road, I had a career crisis, which caused me to sort of reevaluate what I really wanted to be doing, and I decided to go to school to study product design at Stanford University, and that was about 23 years ago. And I'm going to show you now sort of where that led. I did not know where it was going to lead. I didn't know what was going to happen as a result of that. All I knew is that I needed a change, and so it began. Most of what I'm going to share with you today are going to be geometrically based works, but some of them are not. Some of the work I've done is not so geometric. It's maybe more physics and things. But what unites them all is my attempt to try to have things happen that are not expected, that are surprising, that maybe look like they're sort of impossible or magical. So this is one example, these aerobatic balls that are being held aloft by air streams, and they're creating actually what's called a chaotic system, where you can't predict where things are going to go, and the balls sort of change and interact with each other in a way that feels almost anthropomorphic, in the sense that it feels like they almost have personalities as they engage with each other. Here's another piece that is maybe more surprising in terms of the physics. It ends up that the Bernoulli effect, which is what was keeping those balls aloft before, also works with liquids, that faster moving liquids actually have lower pressure than slow moving liquids, and so a fast moving liquid stream will hold the ball in. And so this is a piece based on that. It's called My Turn Fountain. There's 3 fountains that are angled so that when the ball falls out of one fountain, it goes and grabs the other fountain, and it's almost like a karmic thing, because if you steal the fountain from one of the other balls, you end up setting in motion a set of events that will eventually come around and cause you to fall out of the fountain as well. This is a prototype, so things weren't working quite completely smoothly, but we're getting some pausing in the video, I see. Okay. Anyway, again, more physics. This is also, I guess, would fall under the rubric of physics. This was work I did for my thesis when I was at, maybe I did mention, I was at Stanford for the graduate program, and oh boy. Okay, so is there anything we can do about this, or I just plunge ahead with the video not working so well? Because I'm going to need the video to work. Anyway, these swings are connected at the top such that when one person swings, it causes the other person to get their energy, and the energy goes back and forth. This was an exploration I was doing in terms of interdependence and cooperation. So now on to more geometric pieces. Some of you may be familiar with spirograph. It was one of the great toys that was invented when I was younger than you, actually. And I was always fascinated with it. I thought it made beautiful things. They're called technically hypotrochoids. I asked the question one day, what would happen if you put a spirograph inside a spirograph? And that led to this thing called the recursive spirograph, or hypercycles. And here you'll see that what it does is it makes shapes that are not quite as regular as a standard spirograph. They have a little more complexity to their form. So this is one example of the kind of thing it can do. You'll notice that it's not as sort of rounded and symmetric. It can also make lines that are both curved and straight, as you'll see here, or nearly straight. And what's going on here is, by putting the spirograph within a spirograph, is it's creating a second harmonic. And that's maybe most clearly revealed in this next piece. And as with the regular spirograph, it does take some practice to get good at this. As you can see, I got quite good at it. I don't know if that's not showing it very well, but that's actually sped up. I wasn't quite that good in reality. What you'll see is it has 6 bands of sort of woven chords, and the woven chords have 17 bands in each of them, and that's kind of the 2 harmonics that are working. So these are some of the examples that you can create with this hyperspirograph, and they're all complete closed paths. You can also, unlike a regular spirograph, choosing where you begin the 2 gears can change what the entire piece looks like. And so these kind of ribbon-like structures are made by just changing the starting point for each of them, something that doesn't work with a regular spirograph. In that case, I was using gears to actually generate the image, or using gears to help me draw an image. In this case, I'm using the gears directly to create a pattern, a never-changing pattern. This is sort of an exploration of what would happen if you have the gears set so that half of them move at one speed and half move at another speed in a ratio of 3 to 4. And what you see is that various patterns appear, and our brains like to complete patterns, like to complete lines, and so even though the lines aren't following all the way through on this, hopefully you're still seeing some kind of like an integrated pattern behavior. But the lion's share of the work I'm going to show you today is based on spiral geometries. I became very intrigued with spirals during my thesis work. Spirals appear in nature at all levels, and maybe the largest structure we know, galaxies, are spirals often. And we see them in nature as in the botanical form, and even maybe more surprisingly, the animal kingdom produces spirals, not commonly, but here in the case of the nautilus shell. So I became intrigued, particularly with spiral. This is an example of a logarithmic spiral. In a logarithmic spiral, all the elements of the spiral are similar. Those of you that have taken, I don't know if it's called descriptive geometry, where you talk about things being congruent, those are identical shape and size, and similar is same shape at different size. Are you familiar with that? Raise your hand if you're familiar with that concept. Okay, great. So all the elements in this shell are essentially similar, and there's some really interesting features that you get with logarithmic spirals because of the similarity. But I like to make things that change and transform, so the first thing I tried to do was to make a spiral that could actually roll up or unroll, transform in some way. And so here you see this roll-up spiral arm piece. Here's another spiral form, again logarithmic. This is made of laser cut. Most of what you'll see here is laser cut wood frames that in this case, they're attached with glue so that they will, there's hinges at each of those positions between the frames, and by just changing the relationship between the 2 sides of the spiral, I can cause it to kind of curl and uncurl at will. I apologize for the jerky, I think we have there's a little issue with the transmission of the video onto through Apple Talk or whatever it is. This is another spiral, similar concept, except here I've got the hinge between the 2 sides on the outside, and here you can clearly see that all I'm doing is moving my hands apart or together, and I'm able to change the amount of curl on the piece. Also, though it wasn't essential to the design, all of those frames are made from one piece of wood, just cut sequentially. So it was very sort of efficient in terms of use of wood, and a great use of the laser cutter. Something that was kind of new back. The laser cutter was not commonly used back then when I was doing this in about 2000. Here I've taken the 2 spirals and combined them, and by simply pulling a single string, they will curl up into a kind of an S form, excuse me, and then uncurl as the string is released. And I projected onto the screen there to sort of show the shadows created by that ever-changing form. Now this one may look like the others, but actually it behaves quite differently. This is a single set of frames attached, and here I was looking to see, could I make a spiral that really folds up in some way? So here you see it folding flat. Here's another version of it that folds into kind of a triangular prism form, and as such, it creates a kind of a tower, as you'll see here. And I was pretty happy with that. It was fun to see it transform that way, but for some reason I was sort of playing around with it, wanting it to do more. I don't know why I thought it should do more, but as I played with it, I discovered a very surprising thing, which is that it actually has this ability to kind of be stable in an upward direction without any support. So that's just what it wants to do, what you're seeing there, hopefully. It's sort of it's happily working its way upward, seemingly defying gravity. And this is an example of something that I find very exciting when something behaves in a way that seems non-intuitive. It's also an example of what I find interesting about design, that you don't always know where you're getting to. You may have something in mind, but you don't necessarily get there. Sometimes, when you're lucky, you get to a place that's more interesting than what you intended, and you'll see that in some other work here. Well, the work I've been showing you has been much like the piece on the left, a single spiral doing something, changing in some way. But on the left, we have multiple spirals, and I wanted, for various reasons, to create a sort of a network of spirals, and to do that, I looked to nature and the way that it creates things like sunflowers and pine cones and pineapples. It ends up that all these structures, artichokes, even though they look rather different, they all have the same fundamental recipe to create the spirals that appear in them, including this succulent. And the question I had is, how can I create spirals like this? So it ends up that there is this wonderful, simple, profound recipe that nature has, and I'm going to share it with you because it's kind of a delightful secret to be aware of. The first thing to note is that each petal has a unique birthday. They don't come out in clusters of 2, 3, 5, or whatever. They come out one at a time, each of them individually. And so knowing that, we can see that they're going to emerge from the center in this cactus. And you could probably guess that the first one, the most recent one to emerge, was here. And you might guess that the second most recent to emerge was here. See if you can see where the third might have been. You'd probably guess that. Now for the fourth, it's maybe not super obvious where it would be because the distances aren't clear, but I can tell you with certainty that it's there and that the fifth one is up here. Now why am I able to say that with certainty? It's because I know, and you're about to find out, that every time it adds a new petal, it adds at about 137.5 degrees around from the previous petal. So knowing that, and we're going clockwise in this case, that's actually arbitrary. At the very beginning of the plant makes that decision arbitrarily, and it continues for the life of the plant. Whereas number 6 and number 7, number 8, are you guessing them correctly? Able to anticipate? Number 9, 10, and 11, and so on. And that is the recipe that nature uses in making this and all those other forms that I showed you. Now you might think, well, that's kind of a strange, what's the meaning of that angle? It ends up that it's actually a very specific angle that's based on the golden ratio. Because if you take the smaller and the larger of those angles and divide them, you end up with 0.618 or an inverted 1.618, which is phi, the golden ratio. Are you familiar with the golden ratio, folks? Some of you? Great. So this is the radial version of the golden ratio. And as such, it's been given the name the golden angle. And it's a very powerful angle, which all of these plant forms utilize. And in fact, it's the most commonly used sort of design strategy in the plant world in terms of placing leaves and seeds on a head. And it ends up that whenever the golden ratio is used, the golden angle is used, you're going to end up with Fibonacci numbers showing up. Here's the Fibonacci numbers. I assume you're mostly familiar with Fibonacci numbers? If I'd asked that to my high school class, no hands would have gone up. Nobody talked about the Fibonacci numbers when I was in high school. I'm so glad that it is talked about now. So it's made by just taking 1 and 1 and adding the last 2 numbers to create each additional point in the sequence, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. So it ends up that if you look at the ratios of the Fibonacci numbers, starting with 1 over 2, 2 over 3, 3 over 5, 5 over 8, they get progressively closer to being the golden ratio. It's a little high, then a little low, then a little high and a little low, but it gets better and better and better. And that's why the Fibonacci numbers show up whenever you use a plant whenever the plants use this strategy. So in the case of a pine cone, you have neighboring Fibonacci numbers 8 and 13. In the case of a sunflower, it can vary, but in this particular sunflower, it's doing 30, 34, and 55. And so I decided I would make some of these structures on my own and sort of develop this 813 spiral tiling, which became the basis for a whole set of work that I undertook. Because I wanted to make it sort of changeable and explore that, I wanted to hold together. And so the natural thing to do was to make it into a kind of a jigsaw puzzle. And so here we have this jigsaw puzzle that's kind of an anti-jigsaw puzzle. If you think about normal jigsaw puzzles, every piece is a unique shape, but about the same size, generally. This is reversing that. Every single piece is exactly the same shape, but a different size. No two pieces are the same size. So I put this together, and in doing so, you can see that it's got the Fibonacci number of spirals, 8 and 13. And now what I'm going to do is show you sequential removing of the largest piece left in the puzzle at each time. And although it may look arbitrary, it's actually removing them each from going around the golden angle each time to remove them. And you can see from that tower that every single piece is a unique size. So that ended up leading almost 20 years later to a sculpture that I did for the Atlantis, the Royal in Dubai, this sort of mega hotel, super luxe hotel. Never would have guessed it would have led to this, but it did. This is part of the restaurant where they had me create this sculpture to help direct the theme of the restaurant, and it's the largest undertaking I've done. I worked with some incredible engineers and fabricators to build this thing. Here you're seeing the substructure that went into it. It had to all be able to be broken down and shipped from here over to Dubai in an airplane. So there was a lot of engineering work involved in figuring out how to make it take apart. It's made up of 128 individual surfaces with LEDs behind them, as you see on the table there in the front and the left. Lots of electronics and programming went into this. Here you see on the right the behind the scenes of the piece. And here they're assembling the last piece into it to test it. So there's LEDs behind that shine out from it, and that led to this piece I call Dahlia. That is it's a sort of a kinetic piece in the sense that the lights are kinetic, but the piece itself does not actually change. It's completely static. It's just being transformed by the movement of the light. Though it often looks like the piece itself is moving, that's just the result of the light effects. Now, back to this puzzle, something that I discovered unexpectedly is that if I do take out the largest piece each time and then rotate it by the golden angle, if I do that without showing the rotation, it looks like the puzzle is just simply shrinking without actually changing, which was kind of surprising for something that was as complex as this, as complex a shape as this. But it ends up that, oops, did I mean to do that? Yeah, so that was a rather surprising finding, and so I thought, well, what would happen if I took a bunch of those puzzles and laid them one on top of the other? So that tower you see on the left is the biggest puzzle on the bottom, and then I removed the next largest piece, put the puzzle on top of that, and did so sequentially. So each of those stacks in the tower is a sort of an assembled puzzle missing the next larger piece. And then I just rotate each piece by the golden angle. And what I knew would happen is that some platforms would appear. But what I didn't know would happen is that there would be this kind of continuity to it, this kind of flow that happened. Now this was a painstaking animation that I had to create. This wasn't sort of happening automatically. I had to actually animate each frame of that, and I thought, well, is there some way that I can make something that's a little more, it also, if you move it yet another golden angle, you can double the number of platforms, but they get a little bit smaller. Anyway, the animation for that was rather painstaking, and I wanted to make something where I could actually demonstrate it real time. So I made a simple version of it where each puzzle was the same size, or what had been a puzzle, and I put stops inside there, little slots and pins, so that each piece could only move by the golden angle relative to each other. It starts out kind of randomly because the friction levels are different, but as you'll see, as this rotates around in place, it will eventually come into a place of kind of stasis where you see these platforms appearing. Unlike the tower where the platforms get smaller, this one, the platforms are all the same size, but it's the same general idea. Now, and then here I'm going to rotate it back into the other position. By the way, is the audio on? I'm not sure if I have audio on this particular video, but I just want to make sure the audio is on for the presentation. So those stops allowed me, having those stops that allow you to do that sort of minor rotation allowed me to explore this idea I'd always been interested in, which is, can I make a kind of a pine cone form that goes between being flat and being pine cone-like? And I built this structure you see here, And my plan was to just, and there were stops in it, my plan was, just as in the previous video, to turn them and have them sequentially turn into a kind of a pine cone shape. But it actually didn't work at all. It got jammed after about the first 3 turns, and I was extremely frustrated and disappointed. And as I was sitting there kind of bemoaning my fate, I sort of flicked my wrist, and this is what happened. So it was jamming when I was turning it manually, but if I just gave it some momentum, it would naturally want to spin them all and go into these positions. Another example of, like, I had a plan. It was a fun plan, I thought, but nothing compared to the magic of this kind of, transformation on its own. So, I got very lucky here. I only get partial credit for inventing this because I really didn't invent all of it. I stumbled on half of what makes it interesting. But luck favors the prepared, and I was out there trying. This has been made into a product, including something called the Lollipopter. There's a wooden version and the plastic version as well. So back to this trans tower. Back to the trans tower. Remember, these are like sequential puzzles of different sizes laid one on top of the other, or on top of one another. And I thought, well, what if I only make the perimeter of each of them? Don't make the entire piece, just make the perimeter. Then they could sit inside each other. And so that's what this is. I've got a whole bunch of little sort of thin versions of them. And then if I rotate them by the golden angle, they will then stack on top of each other, as you see here. So all that's going on there is a rotation. There's no adding of material. There I'm actually removing every other one. Now I'm going to put every other one back and then rotate them again, and they will work their way down into the center. So that was kind of a fun discovery. This is a simpler concept that came from that more complex concept. Here I have a kind of a nautilus shell form, again with these little thin shells, and then by rotating it like this, it sort of stands up and becomes this dimensional sculpture. I gave one of these to my professor, and I came back a few weeks later and found that his housekeeper had been dusting and had assembled it incorrectly, quote unquote, as you see there. That wasn't what I intended to do, but actually I think that's more beautiful than what I had intended to do. So you never know where inspiration or improvements are going to come. I think this is a more beautiful form, but I certainly am delighted and grateful that there's more than one form available for this. It was kind of an additional, perk. Now, remember that these were made of these sequential rings. I made those on the laser cutter, and when I was taking them off the laser cutter, I would notice that the cancel. I don't know what that is. I would notice that when I pulled them off the laser cutter, the rings kind of shuffled next to each other and created this pattern of movement. And I thought, well, that's something interesting to take advantage of, and that led to this thing called star wave, where we've got a set of rings. They're the sort of star-shaped rings, and by just moving them back and forth, they create this, this sort of ripple effect, almost a moire effect that works through the system. And this is an example of I guess one of the themes here that maybe I should have talked about earlier is that I'm sort of leading you through my thought process, and really what's going on here is I'm just following my curiosity. I try something, I see how it works, that leads to other questions, I then ask that question, and there's this kind of back and forth with the material and with the behaviors. And that's been a crucial part of my work process, has just been to let myself just freely ask questions about what's going on with things. So with the trans tower, a question that took me 5 years to ask, I'm embarrassed to say, is what would happen if when I got to the bottom here, remember what's going on is that I'm just rotating the pieces relative to the piece beneath them, right? And when I get to the bottom, what would happen if I had just kept rotating the tower? Not stopped rotating it, just kept rotating it. Well, that flow would have continued endlessly. And 5 years after making that trans tower, I finally realized the full ramifications of that, and that led to something called blooms. Now this doesn't look like that trans tower, but you can imagine that each of those little pointy elements is the equivalent to one of those ledges on the tower. And if I take this sculpture and rotate it, it's built with the same golden angle recipe. If I take that sculpture, rotate it by 137.5 degrees between frames of an animation or under a strobe light, I end up getting this behavior, which I hope it will transmit. And you see we're starting to get this flowing or ever blooming behavior coming out the top of the piece. And here we see it from the top. And almost all of these are available on my website if you want to see them working a little more smoothly. And that led to the whole development of blooms as a kind of a medium for animation. So again, this sculpture is solid. It's just being spun. The effect of animation is simply a result of it being spun by the golden angle between each frame of the video. And as much as these forms are obviously very different in appearance, the thing they all have in common is that the elements on these forms are all placed by the golden angle, each sequential element. Now remember that the system I'm using here all came from my recognition that nature, or my wanting to take advantage of what nature was using as a growth technique. And so a natural question would be, well, can these be animated? Can nature's objects itself be animated? And the answer is yes. And here's an artichoke that I'm actually animating on a lathe. Nature doesn't worry about making things perfectly symmetrical, so it's going to be rather wobbly, but you can still see the kind of the behavior, in this case sort of reverse growth, and in this version it's sort of repeated growth. And that really is kind of what it would look like if you could see an artichoke growing. It would also be getting larger, but that really reiterates the growth process. So and one more is here's a cactus. You can see the areoles working their way out. So I'd like to close just by sharing this quote from David Mumford that I think really captures what has been my experience of mathematics and actually use of computer science as well, which is that mathematics is not alien and remote, as it is often seen by people who are not so fond of math, but a very human exploration of the patterns of the world, one which thrives on play and surprise and beauty. And I think that really summarizes my own attitude about mathematics, and particularly geometry, and how it's a tool for exploration and has allowed me to explore ideas that without such tools I wouldn't have had the kind of the specificity necessary to be able to do that. And my career path has been a rather circuitous, unusual one. It's certainly not one I would say you could sort of choose to go down. I didn't choose it. It sort of just happened through various things, but I think an important part of what made it possible for me to be doing what I'm doing today, which is enjoying teaching at Stanford and creating and placing my sculptures in various museums around the world, is just that I followed my curiosity. And as I tell my design students, I think curiosity is perhaps one of the most important characteristics to have for a successful life as a designer, but even just for a successful life. The world is full of miraculous opportunities and things that have yet to be discovered. And if we will just let our curiosity run free and really look at what's out there and engage with it, the world is just sort of endless in the riches that it will provide us and lead us through. So with that, I'll move on to questions. Thank you. Yes. Hold it closer, I think.
With the blooms animation,
Yes.
since it needs to like match the frames on the camera, is there like any way to see that animation without looking through?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking. Yes, in fact, you can see them in real life under a strobe light. And in the exhibits that I make and sell to museums, the closest one for us being either Curiosity up in San Mateo, or the Exploratorium. They both have bloom exhibits, and you can see them actually working under a strobe light. Yeah. I can't really see. Raise your hands high or wave them. There we go.
Hi, I was just wondering what kind of like structural or like architectural advantages something like this might have, like if you can create like these similar pieces in different sizes and you can make something so complex. Like, have you gotten a chance to explore that?
I haven't. I do have a fantasy about that the trans tower. Imagine if that were a building, it would provide you a terrace at every single level of the building, which could be kind of delightful and maybe even be a safety thing because it means you could always escape to the next floor below just by sort of jumping out the window, and you could do that sequentially down the building, perhaps. But no, I haven't pursued anything at an architectural scale.
For the wood structures that you showed previously, has there ever, I assume you would have to choose like a flexible type of wood, but have you ever had like, did you have to go through trial and error where like you would have like types of structures that would snap or would break? Stuff like that?
I've had lots of failures, for sure. But the wood itself is actually not being flexible there. It's a plywood, and although it does have the ability to flex, all the bending you're seeing is a result of I wasn't clear about describing this. Those panels are being held together by a piece of cloth that has been glued to each of the two panels, and the cloth acts like a hinge. So the panels themselves are not actually bending, just the angle between them is changing. Do you guys have a laser cutter? Yeah? Yeah? It's a great tool. It's my favorite tool.
Out of all your failures, which one taught you the most?
Which one taught me the most? That's a good. Well, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure there is a most. But what my failures have taught me is that sometimes failure is the door to success. Who was asking? Yeah. Sometimes failure is the door to a different success. Like I was really frustrated when the lollipopter thing was not turning. I had spent a lot of time developing. I was sure it was going to be this cool thing where you turn it and it transforms. And it was really, really serious failure from my perspective. But then there was this lucky break. Now that's a rare event. It isn't like every time I have a failure, there's some greater thing around the corner. But what it taught me is to not assume that I'm completely in charge of the process, or assume that I know what the best direction for the process is, and to be open to being redirected. I think that's a very important characteristic for designers in general, is you set out. Often you don't really know where you're heading anyway, but even if you think you know where you're heading, you always want to be open to being redirected by circumstance, by other people, by whatever. And actually, I just reminds me of a larger point I'd like to make, which is, I feel very lucky the way things sort of came together for me in terms of my background. You know, I was interested in geometry. I did animation for a while, computer science, and I did not anticipate all those things coming together in the way they did, but basically all of those things, and even architecture in a certain sense, came together to allow me to pursue these things. And that's as a result of the fact that I did explore many different directions when I was young, and you were all in that position to be exploring lots of directions. And I would just point out to you maybe the obvious fact, which is that everything that you're passionate about right now and excited about doing right now was once something you knew nothing about, something you had no idea even existed maybe. And yet somehow now it's something that's of great interest to you. And I would just remind you that there's many other things out there like that that you have yet to explore. So you really want to be looking out there and exploring and discovering what's out there. And a lot of the ways we find out what we like is by finding out what we don't like. And you can't know you don't like something until you try it too. There's a lot of things I tried and didn't like. I could tell you about the jobs I've had that bored me and told me I didn't want to do this. And that was helpful in redirecting and guiding my process, my career path, I guess, if you could call it that. Other question? Yeah.
I was gonna ask, in your work.
Where are you?
Right.
There you are.
Have you noticed any overlap between maybe some of those more predictive patterns like Fibonacci and logarithmic spirals and then chaotic systems?
I haven't seen a connection between those. That's a very interesting question to ask, actually. And I think interesting questions is part of curiosity, because creativity is one of the sort of fundamental notions. One of the fundamental concepts of creativity is that it's bringing together disparate things that we don't think have any relation to each other. What happens if you ask how they might relate? So I think that's a really interesting question.
What is the most complex piece you've created, and how did you think about it?
Complex, in terms of fabrication, it would definitely be that piece for Dubai. Was beyond anything I'd ever done. But I had tremendous help with engineers and all helping put that together. What kind of, yeah, so the complexity of my pieces in terms of design is an incremental process, so I don't set out to make something complicated. It might kind of get that way eventually. Maybe here's an answer. I nearly gave up making the first bloom because I did not know how to use Rhino properly. And it was beyond my skill set, and I was very frustrated, but I just was so determined to see this thing into reality, to make these 3D, but I realized I didn't mention, those are all 3D printed sculptures, and the way I create them is I program Rhino, I program Python programming language for Rhino. And so that's a place where my programming really came in very handy. I had the programming chops, but I didn't know how to use this software program for modeling. And I nearly gave up. I honestly nearly gave up, but I just, stuck with it. And that was probably the biggest challenge. Time?